Hello, everybody, and welcome to Books in Hindsight. I'm your host, author Matthew Hines. Today, we have an amazing guest. We have author and screenwriter JD Covert. So it's going to be a really amazing episode. We're going to learn a lot about not only JD's book, Zombie Scouts, we're also going to be learning about the work she does with what is called DID and PTSD, or post-traumatic stress syndrome. So it's going to be a great show, but before we get started, I want to ask you to please consider subscribing and consider a sponsorship at patreon.com/Heinessight. Or just go to Heinessight.com and buy one of either my books or any book by any author featured on Books in Hindsight. So you can find those at booksinhindsight.com and my personal website, heinessight.com. So let us bring out the lovely, the beautiful. Let's bring out JD Covert. Let's go to the phones.
Welcome to Books in Hindsight, the only podcast where hindsight is always 2020. And we explore the great books, works, and ideas of the century. Now, here's your host, teacher, and author, Matthew Hines.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Books in Hindsight. As I promised you, I have an amazing guest today. I have JD Covert. So today is kind of going to be a covert operation, and we're going to be talking about a few things. Now, JD Covert is actually married to a retired Army officer, and so we have so many things that we could be talking about, but today we're going to start off by focusing on what is called DID, which is something that JD is going to explain. We're going to be talking about PTSD, which I know that is post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we're going to talk about JD's books, what she's been doing with the military, and finally, we're going to talk about her publishing experience. So, JD Covert, welcome to Books in Hindsight.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
All right, JD. Well, the first thing that we need to start talking about is what got you into writing. What's your background?
Oh, wow. Growing up, my daughters wanted to be actors, and I was like, no. But they really had this strong desire. We put them in theater, and then they wanted to go to film, and I ended up managing them, being on set a lot. One of them wanted to go into filmmaking. She's actually won awards for filmmaking. And so we were trying to find a script for her to do as soon as she graduated from college, and was looking everywhere, couldn't find one. And so someone said, well, why don't you just write one? And that's when I started. And then about 5 years of classes later, I felt like I halfway knew what I was doing, but that is what started me writing in the first place.
All right, JD. Now, you are one of my modest authors. The fact is, JD is actually writing screenplays for Hollywood right now. They're making movies from her stuff, so she's a little bit more involved and along than what she's going to let on. Now, I want to just bring people's attention to the fact that JD works with these important causes of DID and PTSD, and I just want to give you her website first. It's gettingtoknowus.com. That's gettingtoknowus.com. And if you go there, you can download two PDFs that one is 10 facts, frequently asked questions about PTSD, and the other one is 17 things that you don't know who to ask about DID. So let's not dilly-dally, JD. Let's talk about what is DID and how did it affect you?
DID is dissociative identity disorder, or more commonly called multiple personalities, and it affects me very personally because I have DID. And unlike what a lot of people think when you think of DID, you think of Split or Fight Club or some of those other things. And it's used a lot for your villains and your serial killers. It's actually, DID is a defense mechanism used by children who have been traumatized, and everyone is born with the ability to split. But if you don't have to use it before you're 8 or 9 years old, then you lose that ability. And it's all born out of things that all humans have in common in our autonomic nervous system, the fact that our hippocampus is not fully formed until we're 18 to 2 years old. How if a child is nurtured, they learn to grow up in their social engagement system. If they're traumatized, they end up learning how they start operating in the reptilian. And we know the reptilian system, it's called fight or flight or feigning death. And all humans have the ability to dissociate. In fact, we want our first responders to dissociate. We want our surgeons to dissociate. If not, when we were involved in a tragedy, we would not be helped. We think of it as compartmentalization. And in the DID book, I go into a more in-depth explanation of how DID is formed and how everybody has the ability, is born with the ability to do it. It has to do with trauma during childhood. And the trauma is not a one-time thing. If you have this loving, nurturing family and you're learning how to operate in the social engagement system, a trauma or tragedy happens to you, you get over it. It's like your body has learned to put the right amount of stimuli into it. If you have been traumatized growing up, then your hippocampus doesn't learn to operate in the social engagement system, and you start triggering twice as much or a lot more adrenaline for every situation than normal. No matter what it is, you're going to produce a lot more adrenaline. And one of the things they have found out is that a lot of soldiers with PTSD, the war was not the cause of the PTSD. Their war incident was the trigger. And it triggered them to remember childhood trauma. And the reason that they're having, their buddy right next to them is not having PTSD, and they're having PTSD. And they're finding out they went through the same thing, but one of the soldiers is excreting the right amount of adrenaline, and this guy with PTSD is excreting more adrenaline over the same situation, and they're finding out that it's childhood trauma that actually is causing a lot of the PTSD. And as they're going back and working with these soldiers, not just on their war experience, but going back and working with them on their childhood trauma, these soldiers are healing. It's not like it was, during the Vietnam era and Desert Storm and all of those where the guys are coming back. You've got PTSD. Our guys now are being healed when they're going back and looking at it from a totally different perspective.
All right. Well, I want to just put that on the shelf for a second, and I want to go back to DID because you start talking about like the reptilian system, and the first thing I need to do for people that watch a lot of YouTube we're not talking about the reptilians that live in the earth or those kinds of reptilians. There's an actual part of the brain. It's been so long since I took these psychology classes. It's the limbic system, I believe, but it's it's what we call the reptilian brain, and they refer to it as the 4Fs. And when you get into a situation where you have the choice to fight, flee, reproduce, and what was the other one? Was it feed?
Feign death.
Okay. Yeah, it was the 4Fs, and it's been like 10 years since I finished grad school, so I can't remember what the 4Fs were, but yes, so I want to talk about that. So what kind of, are we talking about a life-threatening situation, or something happens like the loss of a parent or something that can trigger this? Is it a threatening thing or what?
It's threatening. Now, when you realize that we're talking about children, if you have a baby, because your hippocampus doesn't fully develop until you're 18 months or 2 years old. And so you have a baby who is not being taken care of, who's being ignored, who is being tortured, who is being ritually abused. I mean, it can be, that's a huge, wide gamut of trauma. But if their needs are not being met, they're being ignored, maybe you have, you're the baby, here's the bottle, and we'll see you whenever, and you're totally left alone. You're not learning to operate in your social engagement system. You're learning to regulate with objects. And the hippocampus is where we have store our memories, our emotions, and our autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is the one where we breathe, and our digestive system. And it is also where we do our defenses, which is the fight and flight, feigning death, and all of that. So if that isn't developed, then and they're threatened, then they don't learn to operate in the social engagement system, which is part of the it's mammal, and I have a hard time with that word. I'm Southern. I just slur all over it.
That's okay.
In the social engagement system, then their brain develops right. If they are threatened, they don't feel safe. And think about it. So this child doesn't feel safe. They feel threatened, but they cannot flee. They cannot fight. The only thing that they have that they can do is feign death. Feign death leads to dissociation. And we all have parts, and our parts are our experiences. We compartmentalize. We do all of these other things. And so when you have a little baby and they feign death, they end up breaking off that memory, because they do not have the ability, the maturity and the ability to process that situation and that trauma. And so it just breaks off to another part.
Okay. But now is the defense mechanism that you just become another person?
It's another personality, but it's like everybody has parts, and parts are kind of like our experiences. Like we say, part of me wants to do this, part of me wants to do that. Part of me understands, but part of me doesn't get it. So it's like the trauma is so severe, the child feels totally threatened. And so they can't process it. They don't have the maturity to process the situation. So they break that experience off. That experience, that part, has that experience that the child doesn't remember. But that's still part of the child. So that memory, that child becomes a totally different personality. And that personality can be triggered by something that happens that brings the event back to their mind. And so you've got this child who can go back and forth between these two personalities. And if something else happens.
Okay, so what is this extent of the, changing personalities. Like if you're with somebody that has this, are they going to, I mean, I assume there's certain degrees where you couldn't even tell when they flipped, but in other cases where it's very severe, you could be sitting with a completely different person. Is that correct?
Yes, and most switches are very subtle, but some are just. It depends on whether the person is feeling threatened or not. If your alters have to be triggered, you don't even realize that you're switching. You just, there's signs, but you can, most of the time you can pass them off as, I just forgot where I put that, or highway hypnosis, or just a whole lot of other things. But most of the time, the switches are so subtle that people don't notice them. It may be a smell. It could be a sound. You usually notice when the person feels threatened, and then a protector is triggered. And then it's like you go from this mild-mannered person to someone they could be, the defender could just sit there and just be very stubborn. Like, you're not going to get anything out of me. Forget you. It could be something a little bit more aggressive. But the point of the matter is, despite what you read, you see in works of fiction, as a group, we are the least violent group of people on the planet, because how we learned to deal with threats was feigning death. And so when we're threatened, sometimes it's just us setting boundaries, and you're not going to cross that boundary, and we're going to stay firm in this. I'm very logical. When my protector would come out before I started working as a system, and I knew I was DID and started recognizing the switches, my protector was a very in-your-face logical. Like, don't even talk to me if there's an emotion in it. We're going to hit this logically. And so I was, there are none of my alters who are violent, but they can be. One of my protective alters fought a pit bull who was attacking my dog.
Wow.
So, yeah. And would I have done that? Probably not. But my protector saw that we were the pit bull was actually after me. And my dog saw what was happening, and the door was open enough he could run out of the house. So he actually ran between us. But my deal wasn't to, my protector came out, and we got to save the dog. And I literally fought off a pit bull. And so was that violent? You could say that was violent, but I was just protecting. I was trying to save my dog, and I was trying to protect. So, and that's the most violent any of my alters have ever been. And you don't, just to remind me, you do not become your abuser. A lot of works of fiction want us say, oh, you were abused, so you're going to become your abuser. Not people with DID. That's reserved for those people who don't dissociate, for those people who are aware and conscious of the trauma that happens to them. Those are the people that are going to become their abuser when they grow up. We won't. If we're going to do anything, if we're going to take revenge or do any of that, we're going to do it to our abuser. We're not going to do it to the public at large. So there have been it's like the most sensational cases of DID are the ones that, of course, make the news. But if you look at the vast majority of us, that is absolutely not the case.
Okay.
And we're very, very subtle. You're not going to notice when we switch. Just our eyes. You'll notice in our eyes, some of our mannerisms, our handwriting, our body chemistry, all of those things that are almost all internal.
Okay, so if you have, there are obviously lots of people out there that would have this that I didn't even know about it. I mean, I'm a little bit older. I remember Sybil, do you remember that movie? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's really the only thing that I associate with multiple personalities. So a lot of people think that, oh, well, if you have that, then you must be like, off your rocker. But there's probably a lot of people out there that are just normal people that there can be triggers. So is there something you can identify that like a stressful situation might trigger this?
Sometimes it's not exactly a stressful situation. It could be a pleasant smell and you become a little child. So it's just sounds, other things can just trigger, or most of the time you're under a lot of stress. So if you're under a lot of stress getting ready for some event or something, and you just have to let go of steam, you might become one of your alters who just wants to go out and have fun. So they go out, let off steam, and come back, and then you're totally unaware of it, but you're ready to sit down and get to business. And you don't even realize that you've gone off on this little fuge and, done things you have no idea you've done. Or I had no idea that I was DID. I was diagnosed with PTSD for decades because, DID is actually childhood PTSD. In fact, it's CPTSD or complex PTSD. And so so I had the symptoms of PTSD. I had, the depression, the night terrors, all the other things you have with DID, and with PTSD. So it wasn't until the new horse therapy came out, and I started going to a horse ranch for my therapy. And that's actually when they were able to, my therapist was able to diagnose me, because we weren't just in an office setting. We were walking out to the corral. I was working with horses. We were, and we didn't only have our meetings in her office. Sometimes we could have them outside. We just, we were out on a ranch, and we would just do therapy wherever. And it was because we were in different settings. Every different setting, I was someone different.
Okay.
And so that's how she was able to diagnose me. And with the horses, I would change personalities with the horses.
Right. So that became kind of your main therapy?
With the horses?
Well, there's a pun in there, so I'm just going to let it go. So, all right. But it seems to me that what you're talking about is when you're a child and you are basically defenseless, it seems to me that you were talking about that fight or flight, part of our brain, and it really is about anger, because anger is what gets us motivated to fight. And it would seem to me that people that have this, and we're going to move over into PTSD, because I really think there's just a very fine line between
I would say it's more fear than anger. It's more fear. You have to be you have to fear for your life. That's the thing that causes, is not so much anger as you have to be afraid for your life, because that's when our autonomic nervous system starts operating. It's like when our body feels totally threatened, and our body has a memory all its own. And so our body feels threatened, and there's that fear factor, and the fear factor is what triggers the fight or flight or the feigning death. So, of course, once you get into the, fight and fight, that anger is going to come out, because you are.
Well, when this happens to you when you're a little kid, and then you're a 6'5" guy, and you don't, somebody wants to mess with you. Well, then things, now you're more in control, and it might seem to be that somebody who had suffered that may be more inclined to, as we say, fly off the handle or go postal. So I think that people should pay attention, because I hadn't heard a lot about this, and most people have, kind of messed up childhoods. And if you think about all of the kids that grew up in combat or in combat environments now, think of all those kids that have that.
Actually, the kids that grow up in combat situations, a lot of times none of them will ever get PTSD because it has to do with nurturing. And so a lot of cultures where they're in wartime situation, the children are more cherished than they are in civilized situations. When we don't have to worry about war, we're not as concerned about our children surviving. But when they grow up in a wartime situation, the parents are very protective. The odds of their children growing up are slimmer, and so they're more nurturing. So actually, it's like in those environments and situations, kids with PTSD and the adults with PTSD are smaller than they are in civilized nations. And one of the things they've really found is that you need to really be careful about your children's daycare, because they're discovering that a lot of children that were in neglectful daycares have been able to develop DID from that. Yeah. Because they were in a situation for long enough. It's fear. They're afraid for their life for whatever reason. Could be from another child there that they're not controlling. I mean, there's just so many factors. It doesn't have to necessarily be parents. Right. But the child has to be afraid for being in a situation continually. So the child's safe at home and he goes to daycare and it's threatened. And so, it can't get away from it. Even though it's in a safe situation here, it can't get away with it. Whereas in a wartime situation, a parent is going to be more protective all the time and look out for, and the child feels like if there's a threat, someone cares about me and someone's going to take care of me. So actually, it's just the opposite. I mean, that's really hard. It goes counter to the way we think about it. And a lot of this is totally counter. But the new research is totally counter to what we've thought about in the past.
Yeah. Well, it might be a thing, a good treatment or to prevent this, kind of diseases. Spend the weekend over in Baghdad or spend a month in Baghdad for the summer and get the family together. All right. So let's move. And speaking of moving to Baghdad, let's talk about PTSD. And I just want to remind everybody again that JD Covert is an author, and her website is gettingtoknowus.com. And this is where you can find out and download her ebooks on DID and PTSD. So let's talk about your experience. You are married to an Army officer, and do you want to talk about like your supporting his duties?
Yeah, it's really fun when you kind of look at it that way. He's the career officer, and I'm the one with PTSD. So it's just a little bit different. But one of the things I've really discovered, several things. One, a lot of soldiers don't realize that other people can have PTSD. And when they discovered that I had PTSD, it was like they totally embraced me. It's like a lot of them feel like no one will ever understand what I'm going through except another soldier with PTSD. And when they discover that civilians can get PTSD, and it's not just a combat thing, it really frees them because they feel more accepted. And like there's a broader group of people who will relate to them and understand them. But unfortunately, being in a military situation has been a blessing and a detriment, in that a lot of the resources available here are only for soldiers. So if you have PTSD and you're not a soldier, you're not in the military, they cannot fit you in. So that it's like a two-edged sword.
Right. So, okay. So this, going back to, I asked you this before. So what happens when you lose your father or mother that is deployed? I mean, you said that losing a parent doesn't really affect you as far as DID. That's not going to give a child PTSD or DID. So, okay, well then maybe that's why the Army doesn't want to, or the government doesn't want to pay for it. But let me ask you this. Well, I was in the military, and they have no reason for anything except bad ones. So, and I just, well, I'm not even going to say it. I'm just going to go back. Okay. So, let's talk about what soldiers have PTSD. Do you have to be in combat to have it?
No, it's you don't have to be in combat to have PTSD. In fact, like I said earlier, what they're discovering now is that a lot of people who have PTSD, and they don't seem to get it till they're adults, the adult PTSD is actually a trigger for some trauma that happened in childhood. That doesn't mean that they're DID. It could be a trauma that happened when they're 10, 11, 12 years old. They could have been beaten up by the bully, and they did firecrackers and all of this other kind of stuff, and then they get into war. Maybe their best friend was beaten up, and they're there, and they see something happen to the buddy next to them, and what it does is it triggers that childhood memory. They don't remember it because they've compartmentalized it. They've buried it deep. I've had several people come to me and say, I remember everything. That doesn't make any sense. And then after a while they come back and they go, oh, whoa, I remembered this time when I was almost raped, but I've forgotten it for 20 years. And then something happened and I remember it. And then they go, oh, whoa, I see what you're talking about. Because these tragic incidents may happen and they may only be one thing. But if we are too young to deal with it at that time, our body will remember, but our mind will forget because we can't deal with it. So when they get in these situations, the situation will trigger them and their body remembers. This is one of the things I've talked to a lot of soldiers and other people with DID, but since we're talking about soldiers, they will have night terrors, they will be triggered, and it's not like you see on television where they're triggered and they're back in Vietnam and they remember all the ammo and everything going off. They just know they're triggered. They have absolutely no idea. There's no memory. They may wake from night terrors. There is no dream they remember. It's just trigger, night terror, no memory with it whatsoever. And one of the reasons is because our body can remember what our brains forget. And so it's just a body memory. And it's very, very, our body memories are very, very powerful. And we're just now learning about them and how incredibly powerful they are.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions about that, and I had something that I thought was interesting that happened to me, and it's not, as far as PTSD, I never saw combat or anything, but we were talking before this thing started, and I went from small town Washington State to Fort Benning and then Fort Bragg, and I went from, happy-go-lucky, nobody really told me what to do. And then suddenly my life, every minute of my life is controlled. And I'm on DRF. I'm on the Ready Deployment Force. And that means at any minute I can just get sent off to die, any minute. And so, and then we're jumping out of airplanes. We're doing all this very dangerous training. And so every day you say, you know what, this might be my last day. And so when you get out and you're back in, I call the rest of the country Disneyland because nobody really even gets, we were reduced to absolute, at one point we were so happy just to have a fire, we were like, we were basic animals, and people don't understand. And then you get out and now I've got to go to college and I've got to associate with these kids that are getting out of high school and they just don't have any clue what I've had to go through. So is that kind of a PTSD thing, or?
Not exactly. PTSD, you have had to have, there's a lot more to it, and you have to have suffered it for 6 months.
And I wanted to ask you that because you make it sound like if they suspect me of having PTSD, then they have to do a litmus test. Oh, we got to go back and look at his childhood and see if there's any trauma. Is that what you're saying?
Not exactly. There can be one traumatic incident that causes PTSD. It could be something, you could have a car wreck, you could have any of that, but this is just new research. People kind of look at it that way, that you can have, that you have to have a traumatic thing, and this traumatic thing in adulthood is what caused it. But it could be that this was just a trigger. You can have one terrible, horrible event, and it can cause PTSD. What our brain does is when we have a traumatic event, in our REM sleep, our REM takes care of it. If it's really traumatic, our REM doesn't take care of it in just one sleep cycle. So it could take a month of sleep before we're able to process through that traumatic incident. Okay. It's whenever you cannot process through that traumatic incident after 6 months. That's when it's PTSD.
Okay. Yeah, because I always wondered about, the training that they put us through. And I'll tell you a story. I was in, we were in the peacekeeping force in the Sinai. And for our off duty, we got to go up to Israel. And I was hanging out in a town called Eilat on the southern border. I was hanging out with these Finnish guys. They were in the Finnish army in Lebanon. And we were hanging out in this bar. And I don't know what happened. And people told me about it later. But like there were my American buddies are over on one side. I'm with these Finnish guys. And apparently a fight broke out, and I was in the middle of it, and everybody that saw it said, and I'm 5'7", and I'm nothing, and they said you would knock the first guy completely out, and then you went after the second guy, and his buddies were on you, we're all on you, and we had to get in on them. And I said, really? I said, and everybody was going, hey, Rocky, and they said, yeah, you totally knocked that guy out. I don't remember any of that. So anyway, I guess that's what happens when you get into those situations. But I'm like, what are you talking about? I don't even remember any of that stuff happening. So,
and if that is like happens all the time,
well, no, it's
right, and that's and that incident is very much what will happen with PTSD. You will it's not just a tragic incident. I mean, you were going on adrenaline. You were acting totally in your autonomic nervous system, and you were just going. But yeah, you have a little taste of kind of what it's like to have DID, because people will be telling you that you did this, that, or the other, and you have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. Yeah. And that's what it feels like all the time.
Yeah, and I to this day, I kind of go, that's a joke, but it's just that so many people, even officers, said that, yeah, I saw that, I couldn't believe it. All right, so listen, we need to. This is a very important subject. So if I suspect I have DID or PTSD, what should I do?
You should find a therapist, and the problem with DID is this. Most people are not taught how to recognize it and identify it. I was only, I think, the second patient ever diagnosed where I go to therapy, or the second patient. It's very, very rare. And one of the things is, even now, because I had an intern that was in with me for a long while, and he hasn't quite graduated yet, and I was talking, what did you learn in school? What did they teach you about DID? And it's the same thing they were saying 20 and 30 years ago. It is so rare. You will never have a patient with DID. So we're going to tell you, this is DID. It's in the DSM-5. Here's the definition. Go on with your life. So if people who are going to school aren't even learning how to recognize it or learn how to deal with it or any of those sort of things, then and some of them are even told it doesn't exist. I mean, that is still being said today. DID does not exist. Then I think they say there's 1% of the population that has it. I think it's a lot higher. I think it's probably 2 or 3% because clinicians are not taught to diagnose it. So the average is 7 years of therapy to be diagnosed. And a lot of times it's going through up to 12 different therapists until you find one who can recognize it. And that's true with PTSD too. Most of the people who are doing therapy with PTSD are doing the old stuff. And there's so much new therapies out there thanks to Dr. Stephen Porges and his polyvagal theory. And that's one of the things I tell people to ask. You go to a therapist and you go, have you heard of Dr. Stephen Porges? If they say yes, then you go, you're my man or my woman. If they go no, you just move on and you go to another therapist and you keep asking that question. Or do you know what equine therapy is? Or do you know about trauma therapy for PTSD? If they know any of these new therapies, then they're worth talking to. Ask them, how do you do EMDR? If they go, I don't do EMDR, you go, bye. And you go find someone who does. Because it's the difference between healing and getting well and going on with the rest of your life and having to deal with PTSD, the symptoms of PTSD, till you heal.
Yeah, but JD, you said earlier that it's possible to heal it now, right?
Mm-hmm. It's possible to heal with PTSD, which is like, that may be revolutionary to someone who was a Vietnam vet, did therapy, said, forget you, I'm not doing therapy anymore, because I did that for over a decade. It's like, what's the point of therapy? I'm not getting any better. All the symptoms are still here. I'm going to learn how to deal with this on my own. All those Vietnam vets have done that already. And they're not even, it's like, that's who you fit in, you go find someone now because you can heal. They used to think, we'll assimilate someone with DID. The truth of the matter is you try to assimilate, that means try to make whole, someone with a DID, and what happens? They get under stress and then they end up splitting again because it just happens. So now what we're learning to do is operate as a system, which means who is the best alter to handle this situation? And whoever that alter is in charge during that period of time. And you have an agreement to stay co-conscious. So it's a totally different way of looking at it. So you start learning to operate as a system and remember what you're doing, and the best person to do it will do it. So, there's just so much new information, new ways to heal, new ways to operate. And there's a lot of successful people out there with DID that are named people. There's a lot of A-listers out there with PTSD because it is a defense mechanism that helps you get through life and function. So, yeah.
Okay, so going back to your equine therapy, and I might just be hoofing it here, but isn't the idea to give you an enriched environment where are you doing a lot of touching and handling things, or are you just looking and being kind of a passive observer?
Horses read your emotions. So you are literally working with the horse, and you are learning how to see how you're feeling inside by the expression on the horse's face and the horse's ears and the horse's body language. So you're actually learning how to read yourself by the horse, because a horse is a mirror to our emotions.
Yeah, and they can also tell you if you have a long face.
Definitely.
So, well, that is very interesting. But the key, I think, here is, jokes aside, that it is very serious, and that it does take a long time, and you have to be dedicated to getting over this. Is that correct?
Yes. It's not something that happens just overnight. It takes work, and it's very, very hard, and it's very emotionally painful, but it is possible, which is something totally different than what was preached a decade ago. It's like, let's see how we can get you to deal with life and be able to accept this. But now it's like, no, let's heal. And it's hard work, and it hurts, and it's not pleasant. Yeah. But once you get through it, there's this thing called post-traumatic growth. And it is something that once you've met someone with post-traumatic growth, those are the people you want to be your friends. Yeah. Those are your buddies. Those are the guys you want to hang out with. With DID, once you've reached a point, you've started healing, you realize you have this sixth sense that a lot of people don't have. And it's hard to explain. Either one of those things is really hard to explain unless you've actually gone through it. But they are the positive parts of having PTSD and DID. So there is a positive good part, and we do have this growth that a lot of people absolutely do not have. So it cannot be explained to someone else who's never experienced it before. But you can actually come out of PTSD a better person than what you went in. One of the dangers with both of these is substance abuse. And so a lot of people attribute some of the things that they look at as PTSD, like you were talking about the guy, a brawling or whatever with the PTSD. It could be you got the 6'5" trained guy. He could be having problems. A lot of his symptoms and problems could be coming from substance abuse, trying to self-medicate because of the PTSD.
Right. So, okay, but can I stop you there? Now, what about substances that are given by doctors? Should we be careful of any substance given to somebody that has this? There
is no medication for DID. Yeah. With PTSD, there's usually it's antidepressants. And you just really have to be careful about how your body responds. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. You just need to really make sure that you regulate and that you stay in touch with your doctors and that you work with them very closely about what your body is doing. Because there's a lot of negatives, but then there's also a lot of positives. So it's not, medication will not heal you. Healing is a lot of emotional work, but it can help you get over the humps. And with DID, a lot of times once you're diagnosed with DID, they will put you on antidepressants. And the reason is because they're going to dig deep and ugly. And you're going to remember things that your system wanted you to forget. And in order to work through those and in order to heal, it's like just taking the edge off. It's not going to get rid of your DID. It's not going to get rid of your PTSD. It's just to take the edge off. So anything that takes the edge off, as long as, it's handled that way, we're just going to take the edge off. Where you get into trouble is when you're trying to use the drug, either prescribed medication or the, alcohol or illegal substances, if you're trying to use those to escape, because you cannot escape with the drugs, and then you're going to get into really huge, big trouble, because not only do you have PTSD, but now you've got a substance abuse problem.
Exactly. And I'm a member of the American Legion, and I go, boy, I'm there with all these Vietnam vets, and
Yes.
and I go, how many of these guys have PTSD and they're just medicating themselves with this booze? And anyway, it's just, I guess it's what they do. So, we could.
It's the option that was left to them. It's because what we know now was not known back then. And not only that, especially when you're talking Vietnam, they were coming home and they were hiding the fact that they were in Vietnam.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I can also tell you, I live in Washington State where weed is legal and they're smoking weed, So, and actually, I think that that's probably better than they become so intoxicated, like they can't even drive their car home or whatever. And so anyway, yeah, it's really sad. And I really do appreciate the fact that you are looking out for veterans. That's really something, and you need to be committed for. Did I say, it sounded like commended for. After a while, I start to lose my ability.
That's okay.
So, all right, JD, now we have to get down. I brought you onto this show to talk about your book. I want to hear about zombie scouts. Now, it sounds like some Rangers I used to know, but I think this is about some adolescents or somebody actually involved in scouting. So let's talk about that book for a little bit. What's the inspiration for it?
My husband is a scout leader. And in fact, he's like on the staff of the national jamborees, the national world jamborees. I mean, he's really big into scouting. And so we have, scout troops and scouts and all of this. And I was kind of wanting to write now I can't read Goonies. Remember the Goonies?
Yep. Oh, yeah.
We haven't had a Goonies. And so I was like, I want to write a Goonies. And so here are these scouts, and I'm going, what do you guys talk about around the campfire? And they go, what to do during the zombie apocalypse? And so I started asking my neighborhood kids, what do you talk about on the school ground? What we're going to do during the zombie apocalypse? And it was just a reoccurring theme. And so it was, the thought was, well, what if, what if the zombie apocalypse comes while they're at scout camp? So how are they going to handle it as Boy Scouts?
I hope they have heavy weapons.
Yes. And of course, the scouts cannot be the really good scouts. I mean, the best scouts have to be the ones who are the zombies. The zombie scouts have to be the ones who are barely skirting by and are badges. What are those?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, so that's and this is geared towards, I guess, our adolescent audience.
Yes, it is. It's geared for, I worked with a lot of Boy Scouts, which it's a really strange age. So you're talking Boy Scouts are 11 to 16. Of course, I dealt with a lot of 18-year-olds because there are venture crew, which venture crew go all the way up through 20 years. When you turn 21, you can no longer do venture crew. So it covers that age range. So it's for, it's not quite children, it's more YA, but then you've got your younger, your 11-year-old scouts, and it covers a lot of the difference. You've got your 11-year-olds and how 11-year-olds are interacting with your 16-year-olds.
Yeah.
And of course,
remember that.
Yeah. So you've got your conflicts within the group as far as your age is concerned. So there's a lot they have to contend with.
Yeah, there's nothing more frightening than a scout camp out. Well, like I said, I grew up in a small town, so our scouting adventures were real adventures. And if people didn't come back, that was rarely a surprise. So, well, it sounds like a really fun book. And are you going to, is this just a one-time deal with the Scout books, or are we going to have a follow-up?
Well, that's the one that I'm in dispute with.
Okay. Well, all right. Well, now let me preface this.
It is a series, and but I want to get my copyright back before I make it. As I need to rewrite it.
Okay.
I wrote it. You can edit this out. Well, especially now.
No, there'll be no. Now that we're gonna talk about that. It's okay, but I'm just gonna.
Someone has they edit. It was written for boys, so I'm going to tell you right now. It was written for Boy Scouts, and it has all the Boy Scout things in it. If you were a Scout, then you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yes.
The Boy Scouts for Boy Scouts. Well, the publisher had someone who writes YA girls books edit it. So all the guy stuff was cut out.
Oh, boy.
So my beta readers who read it before it went to the publisher, who were 18-year-old, my beta readers were 18-year-old high school football players who had never gone on a scouting expedition at all. And on purpose, because I wanted to make sure that it was going to speak to all boys.
Right.
And so the first time they read it and they go, oh, wow, this is like reading Harry Potter. And then I got the edited version. And of course, I promised them a free copy of the book for this. And there's their dedication. And I gave them the copy of the book and they go, what happened?
Oh, no.
So that's why I don't want to write any more with this publisher until I get it back, because all the things that made it special and all the things that spoke to Boy Scouts, the little things that boys are always afraid of doing. They're always afraid of hitting someone and knocking them over with their backpack. They're always afraid of this, that, and the other. And then the tent comes up and smacks them in the junk. And, all of these things that really do happen. It's like I sat down with these boys and I go, what are you the most afraid of? What's your biggest fear? What is the worst thing that ever happened to you at Scout Camp? What don't you want anyone to know? Mm-hmm. And so I put all of those things in there. Yeah. And they were edited out.
Wow. That's sad that happened, but depending on how realistic it was, teenage boys can be quite brutal. So
I made sure, because it was going to, the youngest boys are 11. Mm-hmm. I made sure it was suitable for 11-year-olds, but the 18-year-olds could get it. If you know what I mean. You could hint at it. So the 11-year-olds, if the 11-year-olds didn't know. In fact, whenever I wrote the script, someone said, you cannot write this PG-13. And I said, you watch me. I will so write it PG. And they go, there's no way you can write it to a zombie audience and make it PG. And I said, that's a challenge. Yeah. And I did. And he read it and he goes, oh my God, you did it. He goes, my whole family can go see this. It is hilarious. And that was another thing. They took out the script. And that was one of the reasons it got back on the slate, is because it's one stunt right after the other. It is hilarious. It's one physical stunt after the other. Right. The boys are actually funny because they spend their whole time bantering, because you got 11-year-olds and 16-year-olds. And so they're just like this at each other. And all of that was taken out.
Boy.
I was like, it was like, it was just really, I was like, you've got to be kidding. And so all of the, and so I figured out by watching all of these PG shows, like Boxcar. What's that Boxcar one? It was a really very violent thing. Mm-hmm. And the one, Gremlins, and all of these others. So I'm watching all of these shows. How did they get a PG rating? Mm-hmm. So I'm sitting there, how did they get a PG rating? Because he had challenged me now. I was, by golly, it wasn't even going to be PG-13. It was going to be PG.
Well, because the violence happens to the non-humans. That's how they...
Exactly. Violence happens to the non-humans. And a lot of stuff happens off screen. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, it happens. I mean, blood splatters all over the person, so it happened, but you don't. So that's what I did. And so when I wrote it, I tried to make sure that a 11-year-old's parent isn't going to go, you can't read this, because I wanted the Boy Scouts to have a book of their own. Because that's another thing. Boy Scouts have not, those were the two things. I wanted to write a Goonies, and Boy Scouts haven't really seen a book of their own since Follow Me Boys back in what? The 50s?
Follow Me Boys.
What do they have? I mean, we have the zombie, the Scout's Guide to the Zombie Apocalypse, and that was just very upsetting to every Boy Scout out there.
Okay.
Because it had nothing to do with scouting.
Uh-huh. Okay, well, JD, let's talk a little bit about, you went on some kind of an odyssey. Now, that was Zombie Scouts is the first book in the series, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that book is now published and it's out. Now,
yes.
Is this the one that we're having a problem with, or is it another one? And I'm going to say this so you don't have to.
Okay.
JD Covert is a screenwriter. Yes. So she actually wrote, according to JD, she wrote the script for this. Mm-hmm. It was approved for a movie, and then they said, why don't you write a book? Yes. And so I have to backtrack a little bit. A few weeks ago, I interviewed Amy Collins from New Shelves Books. And Amy told us all a story about one of her writers we were talking about the choice to publish in the traditional route or self-publish. And she told us this nightmare story about one of her authors that can't get a book out of the publishers because they're claiming they have the rights to it. And then when I'm talking to JD, she says, I'm the one. So, yes. So right now, correct me if I'm wrong, this was actually is a screenplay now, and they want to make it a movie, right? And you can't get the rights.
The publisher has the rights.
Okay, and so you can't make do they want money or?
I do have the screen rights.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the editing that was done in the book, they edited it out of the target audience. This is my superpower, is I can read a script and tell you if it hits the target audience, it misses the target audience. I really understand audience. And the book, when I read it, was really to the target audience, but it was edited out of the target audience.
But actually, JD, the screenplay is the one that you approve of. And It was the book that doesn't even match the screenplay anymore.
Yes.
And you can't do anything about that because
I can't. The screenplay, the script is still in Slate. It's still there. But the excuse me, I'm gonna let her. Our house, we hear everything outside, inside, everything else. Okay. The screenplay is fantastic. I do approve of it. It is slated. The problem is the book came out. We haven't gone into production yet for the screenplay. So the book came out a year and a half ago. And when the publisher edited it, they edited it out of the audience. They put it up without any reviews. Just set it up for 100% failure.
Right.
So I don't own the rights to it because the publisher owns the rights to the book. I own the right to the screenplay, but the publisher owns the book. And the problem is, we don't want the movie to go out until I can get the book and change the book back to hit the target audience.
Okay, and the screenplay and the book are going to have the same title, I assume.
That's what we were hoping for. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And so how does it look?
I have hopefully I can get my copyright back soon. And then Amy will be helping me, Amy and possibly working with Annalisa Parent too, will be able to get it back to what it was before, to where it's hitting the target audience. It's been changed so much that I may need to just, start from the beginning and redo it. So, and there's some things, of course, a movie is so much shorter than the book.
Right.
So when I wrote the book, there's so many scenes that are in the book that I'm like, oh, wow, I'd love to put that in the movie. Mm-hmm. And it's like, but it would make it absolutely too long. Yeah. So it's like, oh, wow, that is just such a great scene. So there's so many good things in the book, but right now it doesn't have the feel that I want it to have, that the movie will have, which is rapid action, a lot of banter with the boys, and all of this kind of stuff that I want to put back in it. And I want it to go out as what it should have gone out in the first place.
Yeah, I'm surprised Spielberg didn't want it because he likes to do these young kids, those kinds of themes. So, well, that's really interesting. So I want to throw in here that the Amy that JD is talking about is Amy Collins, and they do book services for authors, and they are called New Shelves Books. And I've interviewed quite a few authors that work with Amy, and so can you tell how is she getting you out of this debacle?
Well, I went to Amy because, I'm just kind of stepped aside. Okay, that was lessons learned. And I discovered I really enjoy writing the novel. A script is an awesome outline. So I had written two others. One was another film that should go into production this summer. And so I wrote the book before I started rewriting it for production. And so I had that one. And then a co-writer and I just did a show Bible for a television series. And as soon as we finished that, I just sat down and wrote the book. And that was the one I really presented to Amy. And I said, here, I need an author's platform, because Amy does marketing. Right. And so she took my rough draft, she read it, and she goes, okay, we can work together. And that's one thing I like about her is if it was not something that she wanted to work with, or I wasn't someone she wanted to work with, she would have said no right off the bat. You don't have to worry about that. So she helped me. We started working on my platform. She helped get me in with editors. Now, they do not do editors. They do not do anything having to do with publishing. That is not their wheelhouse. Marketing is their wheelhouse. And so then she got me with several different editors. I did different editors for the books. And then she took and had the books and manuscripts analyzed to see whether or not I could go traditional published, because I couldn't make up my mind what I wanted to do. This other publisher was a traditional publisher, and they were an indie too. So they wanted all my rights. I fought for my film rights because it was already optioned, and I go, you cannot have the film rights. They're already optioned. And so, but I had to give her all my book rights. So now that things are handled the way they are, I have no say whatsoever in it. So I was a little skeptical. And so she knew all my concerns. And then after she had analyzed, she got me with Annalisa Parent, who does do publishing. She works with you and gets your manuscripts and you ready to work with agents, and goes from there. So Amy she's been great. I mean, she steers you in the right direction about what you need to do, and puts you in contact and introduces you to the people that she feels like you need in order to move forward and take the next steps. And works with, what she does is help you do your platform and marketing.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because we've had Amy on, and we all know she's the miracle worker. Actually, I said the mechanic that you trust. Yes. in the publishing industry. But but you're somebody that has the option of any time you could go to the traditional route, but right now you kind of feel hesitant because of your last experience. So what you're talking about now, what you're talking about giving to Amy, this is not Zombie Scouts. This is a new project?
Yes, Amy has one called Wasting Away, which is the film that's going into production this summer, is Wasting Away. And another one, which is Beyond the Secret Service, which is just a Bible, a show Bible. My co-writer and I put together the show Bible, and that's the one. Beyond the Secret Service is the one that Annalise is working on right now. She's doing, she's reading it, she's doing notes on it, and as soon as she finishes, then we'll get together and start the rewrite.
Okay. Well, I hate to do this. We're over at least over an hour, and it seems like we've been talking for about 5 minutes. And I knew this would happen because we have so many things to talk about. But it's just been such a thrill to have you on, JD. Is there something you want to say before you say goodbye?
If there's one thing I want to say, it's if any of these guys are listening who you see at the VFW and you're a Vietnam vet, please, first, if nothing else, go to gettingtoknowus.com and start reading some of the blog posts. And when you start feeling comfortable, then start going out and start trying to contact therapists. And it doesn't matter. I was diagnosed with PTSD for over 30 years before I was accurately diagnosed. And I will tell you, it doesn't matter how long that you've gone through what you've gone through. Please go see someone. You can heal. And that is, to me, the biggest thing I would like out there.
Yeah, and I'm going to second that. If you're a veteran out there, if you're a brother veteran, and you suffer from these symptoms, please go get help. We're all together in this, and we all feel pretty much the same way. So you're really not alone. And I want to I appreciate you saying all that. And I'm just going to say this: the author is JD Covert, and she is the author of Zombie Scouts. And also, as we have found out, she is a screenwriter, and she is going to have a couple of movies out this summer. Would you say the name of those movies again?
Wasting Away is a film that is going into production this summer. And the other, Beyond the Secret Service, is actually just a show Bible. We haven't shopped it yet. So it's just our concept, and we've written the show Bible. We haven't even written the pilot yet. I took the show Bible and wrote the book.
Yeah. Well, and they both sound really interesting. The first one, it sounds like Hillary Clinton's political career. It probably isn't, but just from the title. All right. Well, JD, you've at least got a laugh out of this, out of the morning. And I really appreciate you being on. I'm sure you're going to be very famous very soon. And I hope you'll come back and visit us at Books in Hindsight. So I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. If you are watching, if you're a veteran, thank you for your service. And please take what JD Covert has said to heart, and get help if you need it. And if you don't need help, then go find somebody else to help. All right. So I'm Matthew Hines, and I just want to encourage everybody to have a Merry Christmas this season. We'll have a little Christmas message at the end. And other than that, I want to say goodbye to JD. Bye, JD.
Bye. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for being on, JD. And for everybody out there, I just ask you to please keep on reading.
This has been Books in Hindsight with your host, Matthew Hines. Please join us for our next podcast and look for our archives on iTunes and go to thehindsight.com. That's HEINES site.com for great books by Matthew Hines and other great authors.